Welcome to Native Bidaské, Native News Online's weekly spotlight on the people making news and leading change in Indian country.
Welcome to another edition of Native Bidaské. May 5th is known as National MMIP Day across the United States, and that is dealing with the missing and murdered Indigenous people. That is Deb Haaland, the Secretary of the Interior, calls an epidemic in Indian country. And we have a very special guest with us today out of Montana. It's Charlene Sleeper, who is the founder of MMIP Billings. And welcome to Native Bidaské, Charlene.
Thank you for having me today.
Yes, and MMIP is a big thing. And can you kind of even tell our viewers, because there's been so many versions of it, MMIP, MMIR, MMIW, MMWNG. And so could you just kind of talk about the progression of why the name change?
Originally, the MMIWG acronym came out of First Nations work in Canada. It stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. It was part of the Call to Action 41 when it came to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission work that was being done to not only reconcile the residential school processes that they were subjected to in Canada, but to address the issue as far as missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in the tribal communities in Canada. Since then, it's changed over the years. Sometimes people will change it from MMIWG to MMIWG2S to include Two-Spirit people. Sometimes people will change it to MMIWR because relatives is more of a tribal term that a lot of tribal communities use. For my work, I refer to it as peoples, so missing and murdered Indigenous peoples, partly to respect transgender people that are part of the, not only the solution, but are also victims of the MMIP crisis. And part of it is to build community with different agencies that support missing persons work.
Well, thank you for that answer. And I like that clarification just for people get confused. But regardless of the last one or two initials, this is a problem in Indian country. And talk about it. Talk about the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples, the crisis that's there. As Deb Haaland calls it, the epidemic.
It is a significant crisis for tribal communities, which includes urban communities. Today in my research, I was going through and seeing which communities suffer it at the urban level more frequently, and Seattle, Albuquerque, and Billings are of the top 5. There's a number of urban centers that are, I want to say, epicenters of the crisis. For various reasons that differ from reservation-based issues. And so as far as the overall crisis goes, we do suffer from the homicides and missing persons in tribal communities at a higher rate. Unfortunately, law enforcement data isn't as, I want to say, accurate when it comes to capturing the rate that we're actually suffering from these phenomenon. And a lot of that has to do with data sovereignty issues, or the fact that there's times where suspicious deaths are mislabeled as either accidental deaths or what was the other one? I see a lot. I see quite a few of them. It's more often with deaths that are around, I want to say, people that succumb to hypothermia. And so those deaths will be ruled accidental when in all actuality they were it was a contributing factor to a negligent homicide. And so relying on data from law enforcement agencies is really difficult to capture the full scope of what the crisis is at this point.
Yes. And tell us, how did you get involved with this work?
As far as my particular work goes, I got involved with it when the case of Northern Cheyenne girl Penny Scott went missing. She was friends with one of my niece's friends. And so I personally thought maybe my niece may have known where she was at because they ran in the same friend groups. The way that that particular case played out over the course of the month that we were looking for her, it was heartbreaking, and it illuminated a lot of cracks in the system as far as communications go, issues with law enforcement not following through with their commitments when it comes to missing persons on reservations. And so that's really when I got involved with the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples movement.
Now, you mentioned law enforcement, and through the years and Native News Online, we have done quite a bit of reporting on the MMIP issue. And one of the things we've heard in the past is that often law enforcement, particularly in rural areas where they're natives and it's there might be high degrees of racism, prejudice, law enforcement will say really rude things to parents and say, "Oh, that's your daughter. Everybody knows she's just a little tramp anyway. She'll just show up. She's just shacking up," and they really disregard it. Is it still prevalent, or has it gotten better since there's been so much focus on MMIP there in the last few years?
As far as Northern Cheyenne country goes, for the tribal police that work there, I feel like there's been, because so much of a highlight has been placed on that community, I feel like there has been improvements as far as that tribal community goes. The runaway issue with them being labeled as runaways that are non-compliant with, parents or other authority figures, that's a prevalent issue throughout all of America. It tends to be something that happens with a particular age range, especially if it is girls, because there are some behavioral components to it. But more often than not, what we see happening is they're just automatically dismissed when in actuality there may be either a criminal nexus involved, or they may be in an unsafe situation or in an abuse situation. And so we're terribly, as an overall society in America, dismissive of runaway youth. And so, yeah, that's definitely an issue that we see. And then the other one is there is a poor rapport when it comes to, I want to say, reporting anybody missing. A lot of times a missing person requires allocating resources to locating that person. And people will become dismissive if you're not the squeaky wheel in advocating for your loved one, which is why the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples movement really took root, is because people were like very passionate about advocating for their loved one in a way that we want to see systemic change, not only on reservation, but in urban centers as well.
Yes. And May 5th, National MMIP Day, Recognition Day, Awareness Day. How did that come about? And you're from Montana, but it happened up there in Montana, correct?
Correct. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Day was established in Montana to honor MMIP victim Hannah Harris, who's Northern Cheyenne. That's why it was selected as far as the May 5th date, because that's her birthday. Her mother, Melinda Harris, and her sister, Rose Harris, worked with our Senator Tester and Senator Daines to have that established at a national level. And so, yes, that is precisely Montana made kind of national awareness movement.
Yeah, and it's so necessary. You and I were, before we got on, we were actually talking about, whereas there seems to be a lot of emphasis during the months of April and May, but we know it's an ongoing problem. Can you speak to that?
Yes. So MMIP Billings LLC works, I want to say daily, on raising awareness, not only for active missing person cases, but for solutions such as prevention or intervention options in an attempt to prevent homicides and missing persons. There's a lot of different intervention and prevention options available. It's a matter of tribally tailoring them. And so the MMIP work is a daily work for myself. I want to say the National Day of Awareness is more for victim families to honor their loved ones, similar to how Hispanic Latino communities have Dia de los Muertos. It's a day to just dedicate to our collective grief and mourning. But the work really is a daily endeavor.
Yeah, and there's ongoing concerns. Why do you think there's such a high rate in Indian country of people who go missing and sometimes ultimately murdered. What contributes to that?
There are a number of variables that actually contribute to it. One of the key variables is the intergenerational trauma that was inflicted on tribal communities and Indigenous peoples through the assimilation process via the residential boarding schools. And so we still see a lot of intergenerational trauma caused by that manifests in such ways such as substance abuse, which includes alcoholism and opiates. It manifests as domestic violence, which is one of the key, I want to say, indicators that somebody is heading towards either becoming a missing person or being a homicide victim. And so a lot of the issues that we're seeing nowadays are kind of just the manifestations of having undergone genocide and then the forced assimilation process. And so we're currently trying to create Indigenous methodologies that will hopefully facilitate the healing of the residential school process. That's part of the reason why I'm so thankful that Secretary Deb Haaland is taking the initiative in addressing the residential schools, because I personally feel that that's an unhealed wound that we haven't really been able to lance at the level that we need to in order to facilitate the healing that we need to do in order to prevent homicides and missing persons. The other thing that we see a lot of in tribal communities is human trafficking, which is kind of a focus for MMIP Billings LLC this year, is raising awareness for how human trafficking plays into creating missing persons and homicide cases. And so there's so many different variables, which is what speaks to why I had to create MMIP Billings LLC, because it's such a complex issue. It's difficult to encapsulate it in just a few interviews, I want to say. So hopefully that illuminates it to, it's kind of a tip of the iceberg as far as my research goes.
Yeah, I think you just mentioned tip of the iceberg. I think that the enormity of the crisis, I just don't think that the average American really understands that. Maybe not even in Indian country, but more frequently, and even when I'm speaking, sometimes people will stand up and say, you know, my cousin went missing last week. And I remember I was at one college campus, and kind of jars you, because whereas as a writer, I write about it, but when you really deal with it firsthand, and I think that you definitely have much more closer experiences than I do to it, but it must be takes a toll on you, doesn't it?
It does. I am definitely reliant on my recovery support group. So I'm part of the Wellbriety movement as far as Billings goes. And then I'm pretty heavily reliant on my spiritual beliefs. I am a sun dancer, and so I do entrust a lot of my, I want to say, grief over doing the work, because it is pretty harrowing work, to, you know, the Lord above. And because if I didn't have God in all of this, I'm pretty sure it would cause a type of trauma that is really difficult to overcome. So I really do have to credit God with my ability to handle it, because it is a lot some days. Yeah.
And it is, I'm going to say it this way kindly towards our relatives across Indian country. We do deal with a lot of pain, a lot of grief often. And so I'm happy to hear you have a good support system. And you mentioned healing from the historical trauma and that. And what are some mechanisms you use? As you say, maybe through your spirituality, the church, or one thing that I like to tell people: whatever you do, don't get on drugs or alcohol. That's not going to solve it.
Yes, you do not want to be involved with drugs and alcohol if you do MMIP advocacy work, because you have to have a type of spiritual stamina in order to withstand the level of trauma that you'll not only witness, but some of these cases are so horribly heartbreaking, especially the children's cases. I suggest anybody that gets involved make sure that they have some sort of support group, a healthy hobby to express yourself, especially your grief. And then the other one was to make sure that you make space for self-care, like just enjoying life on a regular basis, because I've seen some MMIP advocates enter the movement, and they really get all of their heart and soul involved with it, and it causes a type of burnout that they'll eventually have to recover from. So avoiding secondary trauma is really important. And then the other one is making sure that you have therapy. So going to, a therapist is a good way to make sure that you're taking good care of yourself and getting adequate sleep and having a healthy diet.
Yeah, and I think the messages, and there's been a lot of discussion in recent years, not just relating to Indian country, but everybody, especially youth, is this whole stigma that's associated with mental health. And to say you need help is actually a good thing if you have those situations. Don't hold it in, don't bottle it up, just deal with it and talk through it. And sometimes if you nip it in the bud, you can talk, it doesn't become a full-fledged crisis. And
I do see a lot of stigma in tribal communities around mental health. And I feel like some of that is because people are afraid to share with others, what they've gone through. But part of it, I feel like, is because we tend to think as an overall society that our brains shouldn't get overwhelmed, and they do. Our brains just biologically can become inflamed. And so what I tell people is you have to kind of look at anxiety and depression as like getting a cold. And you can treat a cold. It only takes so long to treat this cold. You just have to put the work in to treat the cold. It's similar with depression and anxiety. Some people have it chronically, and then other people will have just a bout of it. So.
Yeah, I think this is good conversation because it's so necessary in our Indian, among Native people. It's just, we do deal with a lot of crises, a lot of pain, and I think it's okay to say I'm hurting. Let's get to, and we're all taught to be warriors, and hey, even warriors get wounded, and I think that's okay to admit that. So, yeah. Charlene, just in recent weeks, there's been a major case that we at Native News Online, we covered the going missing of Cole Brings Plenty, and then his body was discovered. The police report said no foul play, and there'll be a couple tribes are calling for investigation. His father has said it should be further investigated. His father is a former law enforcement officer out in Cheyenne River, and speak from your perspective. How do we connect that case? It was such a high level case. Of course, his uncle Mo Brings Plenty is on Yellowstone. He's a star. He's pretty popular among Native people. I know when we do stories about Mo Brings Plenty, we get some really the readership is there, and even Cole himself was in the spinoff of Yellowstone 1923. So talk about that. How do we connect the two?
With the Cole Brings Plenty case, I actually assisted with attempting to locate him. Originally, when Joe had reported him missing on Facebook, it was an unofficial missing persons flyer. And so I initiated my work from that point. A lot of people, especially in southeastern Montana, will bring particular cases to me because they're of high concern. The reason why Cole was so important to Crow Country is because him and Mo have been here to do motivational speeches. And so they did go to our schools on reservation, and then they did come to events here in Billings. And I had the privilege of meeting both of them. They're both very, beautiful individuals. And so this did hit me a little bit personally too, because we had welcomed into Crow Country to be good examples to our own people. So when Cole initially went missing, it was an immediate concern as far as everybody when it comes to the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples movement, and the gradual progression of that case into what it ended up playing out to be was horrifying. It was absolutely horrifying because as I step back from it and I look at it from as an objective perspective as possible, the fact that his hair was cut at the Replay Lounge the night that he went missing, it caused a type of triggering of our collective trauma that I know for a fact dates back to the residential boarding school days in a way that I've never seen it impact Indian country. And so we've seen this collective, I want to say, not only manifestation, but expression of this overall grief that all of us have within tribal communities, because we know of the stories of our parents and our grandparents being subjected to not only humiliation, but abuse in these residential schools. And so the initial approach to the Billings case was a missing person. Despite how the narrative shifted throughout the week, that's how I and my teams had worked it, was out of respect, not only for what I understood Cole and Mo to be to our communities, but because his family, was very adamant in locating him, which you should be, even if the narrative changes over the course of time that we're discovering the full scope of the events that played out. So,
yes, and it was a very tragic case, and I do know just from talking to people I'm close to in Indian country, relatives and friends, it really has impacted Indian country, and so. In obviously we would never want to exploit the tragic death, but maybe similar to how after George Floyd case really propelled the Black Lives Matter, maybe this will bring some more attention to the missing and murdered people epidemic crisis that goes on in America. Like I said, we don't want to exploit it, but at the same time, I think that it brings attention to why Native Americans, why did it hit us so close to home? And you mentioned that the hair being cut in, whenever I talked to Mo about it in recent weeks, he just basically, we just want to stick to the facts and not the speculation. And, that's the thing, Charlene, into modern society with social media being what it is, it's so much speculation that goes on, and people read something and believe it to be true. So we at Native News Online, as the family's wishes or even these tribes, we will do some investigative work, and hopefully we can all work together in Indian country, find out what the truth was and help bring it to a bigger focus. We're running out of time, but in 30 seconds, tell us what you want our viewers to take away from this episode.
I would like them to know that there are prevention and intervention strategies that can be implemented in multiple areas, be it public health, education, law enforcement, the arts and crafts that we do. So there's so many solutions. I feel like so often we get caught on the problem and we lose sight that we need to also be focusing on the solutions, and that there are a number of good people out there that are non-native that want to assist and help in the best ways that they can serve. And so I would really push people to start looking towards solution based, I want to say, conversations. Because as much as, we're all in grief and heartbreaking as these cases are, the best way to honor our loved ones when we lose them in these tragic ways is going to be trying to prevent it and intervene in the future, so that their losses aren't in vain. That's really the message I would like to put out to you, tribal communities.
And Charlene, thank you so much. Chimigwich to you for your expertise on this subject, very difficult subject matter, but we'll have you back on Native Bidaské because you bring a lot of expertise to the subject. So thank you so much. And
thank you.
Yes. And to our viewers, Chimigwich for tuning in to another episode of Native Bidaské. We talked today with Charlene Sleeper from MMIP Billings, and we talked about a tough subject, the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis in America. And so this month, with the focus on it, let's pray for our fellow Native Americans and pray for peace and prosperity, and that healing can take place in Indian country. Chimigwich, tune in again next week.
If you appreciate what we do here at Native News Online, we invite you to donate to support our continued work covering Indian country. You can scan this code with your smartphone or go to the link located below this video to donate today. We greatly appreciate your support. Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And be sure to scan this code or go to the link below to subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you for joining us today, and please be sure to join us again next week for another episode of Native Bidaské. Chi miigwech.